Hello again. So, I would like now to talk about the last element in this series, element of the novel, which will help us understand the mechanisms of this literary genre more particularly. And it is one name, point of view. In other words, narrative point of view. Point of view means the stance from which you look at something. The narrative point of view means where does the storyteller stand? Where does the narrator stand? From which perspective does he tell the story? Is he at a high point where he can see everything, or is he at a low point where he cannot see much? He sees only what is close to him. Does he have any supernatural powers to introspect characters more than his own, introspect the inner lives or thoughts of characters? Or is it what kind of point of view is this story told from? This is important because it will affect the nature of the story, the credibility of the story, etc. As we shall see. Point of view is one of the most complex aspects of the novel, theoretically speaking, and that's where most experimentation takes place, actually. So the narrator is an intermediary between character and reader. He is the one who tells us the story of the characters. He's the one who describes the action of the characters. He's the one who describes where the characters move and act. So he's an important component or agent in the story. But he is sometimes visible and at a time and at other times invisible, depending on the skill and the volition of the author. Where there is a story, there is a storyteller, right? Yes, true. Where there is a story, there is a storyteller. But he's more or less disguised from one story to the other. Traditionally, the narrator of the epic and mock epic, alike, acted as an intermediary between the characters and the reader. The method of reading is not very different from the method of Homer. In other words, in the epic, the narrator is a sort of commentator, makes reflection on the events. He filters most of the events, and he's a moral judge of everything that goes on. The same thing in the mock epic, that is the picaresque or something like that. So they have the same attitude. Sometimes the narrator boldly imposes his own attitudes. He says them, he comments. I remember a novel entitled The Way of All Flesh, in which the narrator made plenty of comments. Always he assumed an omniscience that tends to reduce the characters to puppets and the action to a predetermined cause with an end implicit in the beginning. Yes, it's a dilemma. If the narrator is omniscient and is too much present in the story, it affects the outcome. It affects the credibility. It makes things very predictable. And readers are suspicious, especially sophisticated readers. They are suspicious of the story when the narrator is ubiquitous. Many innovative novelists were unhappy with the omniscient narrator, and they invented techniques that show characters as being independent and without intervention of the author. Because the ones who pay the price most are the characters when the narrator is ubiquitous, as I said just now, when he's very much present. The characters turn out to be just like puppets, just manipulated, and the artifice is laid bare, and the story becomes less and less credible. So the modernist novelists or the innovative novelists, they wanted to avoid and to sidetrack this problem of the omniscient narrator, and so they invented techniques that show that characters are as being independent. Well, they are not fully independent. They cannot be independent. They are man-made. They are creations. They are creations of the novelist, the storyteller. But it's just an attempt to disguise things. So the epistolary method was invented, and it is a case in point. When you put your novel in an epistolary form, like Richardson's Pamela, just characters writing letters to their relatives or to their friends, and therefore they speak their own language, they speak their own thoughts. So there seems to be no intervention of the narrator. But again, even in this case, it can be the trick can be revealed or uncovered, and you could guess that the author is manipulating things, is choreographing the thing from behind a curtain. So the epistolary method, most notably used by Samuel Richardson in Pamela 1740, one of the earliest novels, immediately after Henry Fielding's Robinson Crusoe, and is also Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his La Nouvelle Héloïse, published in 1761. So this epistolary method has the advantage of allowing the characters to tell the story in their own words. But it is hard to resist the uneasy feeling that a kind of divine editor, divine between inverted commas, divine editor is sorting and ordering the letters in his own pattern. It's an artificial thing. So the epistolary method settles the problem only partially, only partly. This is Samuel Richardson, and this is the title page of his novel Pamela. The use of the first-person narrator limits the material for the narration. Ernest Hemingway uses the first-person narration very, very often, but again, it limits the scope for the narration, because the first person cannot see what other people see and cannot use other perspectives, and he limits himself. A person can tell his own story, but it turns out to be a very subjective sort of story, because it does not include other points of view. The device of making the narrator also character in the story has the disadvantage of limiting the material available for the narration, since the narrator character can know only those events in which he participates, or the other things or the other aspects of the story will be just hearsay what he heard, what was reported to him. The technique of the story within the story, such as Conrad's Heart of Darkness, is a smart device actually, for which I have a great deal of admiration. So Marlowe in Heart of Darkness, he is a character, but he tells the story. So there is the author, and there is Marlowe, and there is the story. So it's another tier of narration, and it works perfectly for Conrad, and it is a very good story. So we don't see Conrad commenting, it's Marlowe commenting. So we tolerate him because he's a character, we tolerate his subjectivity, we tolerate his judgments or his moods, and so on. The same thing applies to Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. There is Nick Carraway who tells the story, or most of it, and therefore Nick is a character. He comments, so we take his judgments with a pinch of salt, and therefore, the trick works. Fitzgerald is not guilty of any or of much involvement or artifice in the story. So it works. There can, of course, be a number of secondary narratives enclosed in the main narrative, and this device, though it sometimes looks artificial, has been used triumphantly by Conrad, as we said in Heart of Darkness, and on a lesser scale by William Somerset Maugham in The Razor's Edge. The main character tells what he knows directly of the story, and introduces what character B has, and character C and D have told him about the parts of he does not know. It works, as we said, triumphantly for some authors. An extreme case of a narrator who does not understand the story he's telling is one by Ford Madox Ford, used by this author Ford Madox Ford in The Good Soldier, published in 1915. The device of the storyteller who does not understand the story he's telling. I have not read this novel, so I cannot comment about it. Lord Madox Ford. I've never had the opportunity to read this gentleman. The Good Soldier. There is also the technique of the unreliable narrator. He's an unreliable observer, so he doesn't tell us everything, he doesn't know everything, so he's unreliable, understanding better than the narrator, has the illusion of receiving the story directly. Joyce, in both his major novels, that is Ulysses and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, uses different narrators for the various chapters. Joyce's case of the sophisticated attempt to use a reliable narrator still draws attention to his involvement. He himself said once that he was like a god paring his nails behind a curtain, but that's not really true. Joyce draws attention to himself despite his dexterity and his skill. So he approaches in personality of a sort of disembodied parody. Yes, he parodies narrators and started, especially in chapter 14 of Ulysses. For example, an episode set in a maternity hospital is told through the medium of a parodic history of English prose style, a tour de force in style, of course, but still I mean, it draws attention to the author, but more often than not, the sheer ingenuity of Joyce's techniques draw attention to the manipulator in the shadows. He is in the shadows, but we cannot forget about him. I think we forget more about Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby than we do about Joyce in Ulysses. The reader suspects that the novelist edits the stream of consciousness and interior monologue of the character. All right, we can take it for granted that Joyce is using the stream of consciousness, or Virginia Woolf is using the stream of consciousness, but we know that there is somebody who is arranging that stream. That stream is not natural. It is guided through canals arranged by canals or channels arranged by James Joyce or Virginia Woolf or whoever. The reader is aware that of the author's cleverness, where he should be aware only of the character and their actions. The author is least noticeable when he is employing the stream of consciousness device, by which he inchoates thoughts and feelings of a character are presented in interior monologue. But still, this doesn't mean that Joyce was unsuccessful. He was extremely or very successful in portraying the characters of Leopold Bloom or Stephen Dedalus or Molly Bloom for that matter. He is successful. He manages to depict the characters, although his dexterity or his skill or his cleverness in manipulating point of view is clearly apparent. The stream of consciousness or the interior monologue are apparently unedited, but they are, and sometimes deliberately near unintelligible. Yeah, there are some parts of Ulysses which are really baffling readers who cannot really follow, and some readers give up reading this novel in the early pages when they cannot make out what the character is actually talking about or reflecting about. This leads more towards psychoanalysis than to art. Yes, many people think that Joyce goes too far in his exploration of the psyche. He becomes a psychoanalyst more than an artist. This is a point of view. This is a judgment, but not everybody does. He is an artist. He remains a great artist nevertheless. An artist who makes use of psychoanalysis. Why not? Joyce's attempt to achieve total objectivity is an impossible dream. Yeah, he tried to an impossibility. For example, in his Finnegan's Wake, that attempt at objectivity becomes almost absurd. That's why I personally think that Ulysses is much more successful kind of work than Finnegan's Wake. It is because this technique seems to draw fiction into a psychoanalysis consulting room, presenting the raw material of either art or of science, but certainly not art itself. That's the case of Finnegan's Wake. However, that Joyce felt impelled to impose the shaping devices referred to above. Joyce, more than any novelist, sought total objectivity of narration technique, but he ended as the most subjective and idiosyncratic of stylists. I'm sorry to say so, especially for Finnegan's Wake. There is no perfect narrative point of view. Point of view is a device used to tell the story is a standpoint, is a vantage point from which we tell a story, but it cannot be perfect. It cannot tell you the whole story, the entire story. Only God can tell us the whole story. See Hemingway's extreme solution of absence of stylistic embellishment. Yes, well, this is a case of the Old Man and the Sea, where embellishment, stylistic embellishment, is reduced to a minimum. Only one metaphor here and one metaphor there. Metaphors are very rare in Hemingway, where they are plentiful in other novelists. The problem of a satisfactory narrative point of view is in fact nearly insoluble. Yes, every author, every novelist tries his hand at point of view, and he achieves some successes and some failures as well in the way. The careful exclusion of comment, the limitation of vocabulary to a sort of reader's lowest common denominator, the paring of style to the absolute minimum, these puritanical devices used by Hemingway, for Hemingway, who, like Joyce, remains nevertheless a highly idiosyncratic stylist, but not for a novelist who believes that, like poetry, his art should be able to draw on the richness of wordplay, allusion, and symbol, and figurative language. The difficult task of the novelist is to find equilibrium between all inclusion and self-inclusion. Yeah, it's a question of equilibrium. We should strike a balance between between a narrator who has some right to express certain things, and a story that needs to be as objective as possible. For even the most experienced novelist, each new work represents a struggle with the unquestionable, unconquerable task of reconciling all inclusion and self-exclusion, excluding himself. It is noteworthy that Cervantes in Don Quixote and Nabokov in Lolita 1955 join hands across 4 centuries in finding most satisfactory the device of the fictitious editor who presents a manuscript story for which he disclaims responsibility. Well, it's a trick. It is visible. So you say it's a document, it's a manuscript found and given to an editor to publish. It's a lie, of course. It's a white lie, which can serve the purpose, which can help the author, but it's not a perfect one anyway. But this highly useful method presupposes in the true author a scholarly or pedantic faculty not usually associated with novelists. So thank you very much for listening. I will send you these presentations in a package tonight, and the next ones maybe on Thursday. I will devote tomorrow for my Shakespeare class. The next presentation will be directly an analysis of the text of The Old Man and the Sea. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you later.